So, welcome to Blitzscaling a Startup. I am Julian,
And I am Chris.
and I am hailing from a new town, Bangkok, Thailand. So, not super far from where I was before, but super more exciting. So I'm in a great mood, although a bit tired.
Bangkok's a great city. I love it. Now, I remember, Julian, you had this plan that we talked about, which is you were going to actually have a friend drive you part of the way and then take a bus the rest of the way. How did that travel go for you?
Yeah, so we went. So we got. It's actually my neighbor. This is a great thing in Thailand, right? Just like pay a guy $100 to drive you somewhere. So I got my neighbor to drive me to a border town called Mysot. It's a really interesting city. It's like I mean, there are no tourists who go there, um, but I thought it was really interesting. And it's kind of like one of these areas that's on the Belt and Road Initiative, like the
Hmm.
Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So it's really interesting to kind of like see. It's also, I think, the border crossing that has the most illegal border crossings in the world.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it's strange. Like you're there at the border, and they have a market in Burma, and you can kind of like reach over and buy stuff.
That is
From
hilarious.
yeah.
So, literally, the market is set up at the border so that you can shop across the border.
Well, so it's more essentially yes, but in the details, no. So the way it works is the Thai government has a kind of like zone along the border that you're not allowed to go to at
Hmm.
all,
Hmm.
and then they let Burmese people kind of illegally come into that zone, sell things from that zone. So the Burmese people illegally cross, into like, 20 kilometers of Thailand, and they set up their shop and they sell
Got it.
stuff.
Got it. So, if you're Thai, you don't have to do any border violation.
Yeah.
The Burmese merchants are violating the border for you. And the Thai government is not enforcing because they
Yeah.
tacitly approve.
Yeah, and there are a ton of things, you have all these like really cheap um seafood. There's a lot
Hmm.
of really cheap seafood, a lot of rare woods that they clearly kind of like import from Burma. A ton of like illegal of antiques that they kind of like rob from various things in
That's
Burma.
unfortunate.
Um, and so it's just really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is how strong the Chinese presence was there.
Oh, of course, because it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. So I thought it was fascinating. They have big Muslim community, so we eat a lot of essentially Indian food, but it like so well, they're Bangladeshis,
Hmm.
they consider them to be Muslims, but they're essentially Indians.
Right.
Yeah, so that was fascinating. Then we went to a town called Sukhothai, which was the first capital of the Thai Empire. Or I don't know what. Just a lot of ruins and temples and stuff like that, but very bad Wi-Fi. So someone wanted to talk to me, and I was like, okay, I'll jump on a call. My Wi-Fi is going to suck, and it sucked a lot more than I expected.
Mm, got it. Well, it sounds like you had, again, I won't say that it was a friction-free journey, but at least a relatively straightforward and safe journey.
Yeah,
That's what really important.
yeah, it was great. And I've been now in Thailand, well, in and out in Thailand, for the last several months, and I haven't visited anything. So it's fun to do a little bit of tourism.
Well, there's some good stuff in Bangkok as well. I mean,
Yeah,
I think I mentioned to you my first trip to Bangkok. I did see the famous temple and the former royal
yeah.
residence and everything like that, and that was cool. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's a great country, and mostly I think Bangkok itself is really like a world class city. And I really like being here, despite the time zone. But I still like. I think if I could choose, I would not be here. But it's not like I'd just be in the U.S., which I will be soon. I'm paying for rent now, so
Oh my gosh! Well, when are you getting here?
I depends on Kelly, my wife's parents. Like if we want to get in a last trip to visit them or not. But
It
Tech,
is. You are on this side of the Pacific right now, so it's probably a good idea to do that if she wants to see her parents, of course.
exactly. It's just we want to rack up all the brownie points we can, because once I start my next business, it's kind of, I'm not going to do it. And then,
Yeah.
I can't come here. It's the time zone is just too unproductive.
Understood. Understood. Well, I'm glad the trip went well. Glad you're settled in Bangkok, one of my favorite cities. What are we talking about today?
So we're talking about something that's germane to marketplaces,
Hmm.
or let's not use obnoxious words, so specific to marketplaces. And as you know, Chris, I am thinking of potentially building a marketplace myself,
Hmm.
which is why I was thinking about this. And okay, so the context is when you build a marketplace, my understanding of the best practice is that you want to focus all of your energy on one side of the marketplace, or like the majority of your energy on
Hmm.
one side of the marketplace. So let's say for Amazon, they have a two-sided marketplace. They have buyers and sellers, and they focus a lot of energy on the buyers, so the consumers, because the way that their business functions, that kind of like drives everything else that makes everything work. So as long as you have a lot of consumers who want to buy stuff on Amazon, everything kind of works. Yeah. So what I want to ask you about is how, like, whether that dynamic changes, whether it's possible to have a business where that dynamic changes. So let's say for Amazon, they'd be 100% or mostly focused on buyers, consumers, and later move over to the sellers. But before we get into that,
Hmm.
can you tell us, because you've done a lot of marketplace investing, what like tell us about that dynamic? Like why is it like why is it so hard to build marketplaces? Why do you need to pick one side, etc.?
Sure. So, and by the way, one of the great resources for this is my friend Andrew Chen's book, The Cold Start Problem. Andrew Chen being a very famous venture capitalist who's with Andreessen Horowitz and has done a bunch of other cool things in his time, including starting Reforge. And his book, The Cold Start Problem, is all about this. So, point number one, you have to think about what is the product of the marketplace? What does the marketplace do? And the core product of a marketplace is liquidity. In other words, if you're a buyer, you find a seller. If you're a seller, you find a buyer and a transaction occurs. So, core product is liquidity, and anything that gets in the way of providing that core product is something that you will probably have to work around. And the cold start problem is a reflection of that. The cold start problem is simply, well, if there's no buyers, why are the sellers going to go there? If there's no sellers, why are the buyers going to go there? And so finding a way to overcome that cold start problem is critical. Point number two, the typical advice for any marketplace is to start on the supply side of the equation. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. In most cases, but not all, in most cases, the folks on the supply side, who are the ones who are going to be getting money, are more willing to tolerate illiquidity because you're not asking them to just put their lives on hold. You're saying, hey, new Airbnb host, just list your room. And if somebody books it, we'll let you know. And there'll be time for you to clean up and get the stuff out of storage and so on and so forth. Or if you're driving for Lyft or Uber, it's like, hey, you're not using your car anyways, and we'll let you know when you can make some money with it. So classically, it's let's go ahead and get supply first. But that doesn't have to be the way that it's done. And that takes us to point number three, which is it is sometimes possible to create a marketplace off of some other asset that is not a marketplace. So you mentioned Amazon, for example, which is a massive marketplace. Amazon Marketplace accounts for the bulk of the goods being sold. It's actually great for Amazon. It means that they don't have to carry inventory. In fact, they're getting paid to store that inventory. They're getting paid by their sellers. That's only possible because Amazon first built this massive audience of buyers. And Amazon built this massive audience of buyers by being a merchant themselves. And so Amazon you could think of as a company that begins as a retailer, but leverages the strengths of that retailer, the scale of operations and expertise, to eventually go into being both a marketplace and a cloud provider. And it's the original core retail business that enabled those, because that allowed Amazon to build up the assets and capabilities to go after those. So that's what's going on with a marketplace. If you have a marketplace, the goal should be liquidity, and you should go after whichever side of the marketplace will allow you to deliver better liquidity to the important half. In the case of Airbnb, it's let's go get a bunch of hosts so that when guests come in, there's a place for them to stay. In the case of Amazon, it was let's build up this massive array of consumers so that every merchant in the world will want to sell on our platform. But the whole point is to ultimately deliver that liquidity to both sides of the marketplace such that they never want to leave. That's what makes marketplace businesses so powerful. It's a two-sided network effect, which is extremely strong. And what I tell people is, of course, the thing about the strength of that network effect is going to increase with the size of the transaction. It's going to increase with the level of selectivity and differentiation. So Amazon, for example, its size of transaction is not necessarily that huge, although it's decent, but the selectivity is so critical because people want to go to Earth's largest store and get all the different possibilities. Whereas with an Uber, there's really not a lot of differentiation of the product. There's a relatively small transaction, which is why it struggles relative to an Amazon or an Airbnb in terms of having strong network effects.
So here's my understanding of one of the core challenges of marketplaces, and I want you to kind of comment on it. Just what you're doing when you build a marketplace is you're building two products for two different customers, right? The demand and the supply customer.
Yes.
So in the case of Uber, they have a supply side or demand side product, which is what we would use, right?
That's right.
Which is where you hit a button and you get a cab. And then they have a supply side product, which is, yes, the app, but then they also have insurance. They have like how to buy a car, like all this infrastructure, which is invisible to us.
Which tends to be, by the way, more complicated as well.
Right. And so my belief, and you would know this a lot better than me, I've never built a marketplace, but my belief is it's really, really complicated to build two different products for two different customers.
Yes.
And the way you deal with that complication, or one way that you deal with that complication, is by, at least at first, not doing that, or doing that as little as possible. And in fact, choosing one side and saying, we are going to spend all of our effort working for that side. So let's say Uber invests a lot more. Like if you're an Uber app user, like you and I would be, the app hasn't changed. It hasn't really improved since forever. While for the drivers, like it's always improving, and they spend a lot of effort on the driver product because they've realized the main thing matters are the drivers. Therefore, we're focusing on them. So is that right, or am I missing some important elements?
So there's a couple of nuances there. The first is that one of the reasons the Uber app hasn't changed much is because it's difficult to significantly improve the user experience. If it serves the needs of the user and there's no particular degree of friction, then the best way to serve the user is simply to increase liquidity so they get their rides faster and cheaper. And so you could argue that the best way to improve the consumer experience of Uber or Lyft or any ride-hailing product is to improve the driver experience so that you have greater liquidity, lower prices, and you're able to have greater selection. So I think that that's one of the reasons why, it's funny sometimes focusing on product changes to the supply side product is actually the thing that produces better results on the demand side product. Because again, the core product is not software. The core product is liquidity. And if I could get an Uber simply by speaking my needs out loud and not having an app, I wouldn't really care. So the second thing is, if we are to think about the two sides of the marketplace, one of the ways that you get around the build two different products at once is to actually hack it with one side being largely manual. And so this is classic for a lot of marketplaces where people have latent demand, where it's like, oh, I'm looking to buy this. And then you go ahead and in the background, you're like, oh, yes, the marketplace will provide. And really what you have is human beings saying, well, who the hell do we know that could actually fulfill this? And so use of the human artificial intelligence or the human automation, in other words, very manual work, is something that's happened with a lot of marketplace businesses as well.
So, right. So let's take Airbnb as an example. I think famously, Airbnb tends to mostly focus on hosts. Uh, and obviously they want to provide a good experience for
Right.
everybody, but they mostly focus on hosts. And I think even their foundation story is not, hey, I want a hotel. It's, hey, I want to rent out my apartment so I can make rent. Like the whole thing, the whole business was inspired
Yes.
by creating value for the hosts.
Yes. And part of this is, again, a reflection of the dynamic of the transaction, which is the hosts or drivers are interacting with you regularly on a daily basis, many times in the case of Uber, many times per day. Whereas the consumer, the driver, the guest, interacts with you very infrequently. So obviously, when it comes to building habits, it is easier to build the habit of someone who's doing things on a daily basis, and probably more important to do so because you need those suppliers coming in every single day, working through potential transactions multiple times a day. And so that's one of the reasons why they are a major focus, even though, again, as we mentioned, the money in the system comes from the buyers.
And I suspect another part of the dynamic is, so say if you're an Uber driver, you have to buy a car and leave your job
Right,
and commit to Uber. If you're a Airbnb host, you're paying rent or your mortgage, and there are people come into your house and might trash it.
right.
So there's just like a lot more risk or a lot more commitment made by the hosts.
Yes
Um,
and yes and no. So it is, but part of it is there's a bit of an adoption curve. So with Airbnb, with Uber, the initial adopters are people who already have the asset. So in the early days of Uber, the first person to drive for Uber didn't say, I'm going to quit my job, buy a car, and drive for Uber. Somebody who already had a car, already had a job, had some spare time, and decided to do that. Same for Airbnb. Nobody at that point in time was saying, I'm going to buy a house and Airbnb it, or I'm going to rent a house and Airbnb it. They were like, oh, I've got a spare bedroom, or I'm going to be out of town for this period of time. So part of how you get that initial supply is you pick off the early adopters for whom becoming part of the supply has less cost, less hassle, greater upside. And so as you prove that your business model works and people can actually make money, then the greater degree of certainty and greater volume then attracts more people in off the sidelines in the classic way that any supply and demand curve would.
yeah, so it's kind of, so let's say for Uber when they started, I think what they did is they just hired a bunch of black car drivers
That's right.
and said, like, go and drive, and then they focus all their effort on the consumers like you and I, and then like I'm kind of using the framework you gave, which is like, so then they said, okay, well, we're going to stop paying an hourly rate to these people, but we're going to become a marketplace, but it's going to become marketplace of black car drivers and of normal consumers. So they were again getting this demand, this supply where they're already driving around. So this is just like a bonus. And then now because they need so much scale, they've moved into a point where it's like, hey, the we need to generate this hard to generate supply, and it becomes a massive pain and requires a lot of work. Like, is that the right analysis?
Yeah, again, it's a staged process, and there are still black car drivers and services on the system, but they then differentiate them out as Uber Black, because what happens is the reason those black car drivers were willing to come on is they were being paid a lot of money. Uber was subsidizing. In fact, Uber was paying drivers more than they were collecting from riders. And that was necessary in order to bridge the gap and where there would otherwise be no liquidity naturally in the marketplace. And even today, you could not get the black car drivers to drive for much less. They have alternatives versus the average consumer, the average driver who does not. And so that's why you have the differentiation, right? You have the lower cost for the Uber X versus the Uber Black.
Yeah, I'm really interested in understanding, how this works over time, because I think so when I think about, business that I might start or anybody watching this podcast, it's like you need to understand the underlying mechanics of that business, which is already hard, right? So it's like, how does this business model function? But then it feels to me like there are, at least for some businesses, the additional complication that the way the business model functions changes over time as you go out of the kind of low-hanging fruit supply and demand, as different dynamics kind of come up, and then you have to the business model is just different. The key
Right.
drivers are different, and then the final thing is, it does feel that while it's true that these things do change over time, you don't need to sit and wait for them to change. You can, on day zero, think about how they will change over time and take actions knowing, like, you can kind of see around the corner pretty easily just by thinking through how these dynamics will change. Maybe you won't be 100% right, but you can have some visibility. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And that's why, again, I return to the very first point I made, which is that the product of the marketplace is liquidity. And the way that you're able to anticipate change, the way that you're able to steer your business to grow most effectively, especially over the long term, is to understand what you are truly providing and to then look at everything through that lens and to think about things rigorously, right? When people take a rule of thumb, oh, start with supply, that's great. It's going to work in 70 to 80% of cases, but it won't necessarily work in your case. It's better to understand the underlying principle rather than the simplified rules of thumb that result from those principles.
And the underlying principle is you're selling liquidity, and then where is the liquidity missing, and what can you do to get that liquidity that is missing?
Correct. And in many cases, it involves doing something that is not going to be the long term solution, whether it be the subsidization or going after a particular group that will not be the long term bulk of suppliers in the case of the Uber Black drivers. But as long as you think about it in the context of, okay, here's my ultimate goal in terms of liquidity, and here are steps I'm going to take along the way, it all actually makes sense.
So let's say if I was Amazon on day zero, I would say, okay, well, I need to bring together, sellers of books and buyers of books. And for me to get the sellers of books, I need to have buyers of books, and it's going to take a while to get to, because there's so much variety of books, to get to a point where it makes sense for anybody to list themselves on my marketplace. So how can I generate the liquidity that I need to attract the both sides? And the solution is, I'm just going to buy the books myself to create the liquidity for the buyers, and then sell them as a bookseller. And doing that, so creating that liquidity, will bring a bunch of book buyers onto my platform, which will create the liquidity that's required for the booksellers to then want to list. And then you say, and then you'd ask yourself, well, at that point, once the booksellers want to list, where is their lack of liquidity going to be? Is it still going to be on the book buyers? Is it going to be on the booksellers? And you can try to plan that out. Is that right?
That's right. And again, what you're looking at each stage is just understanding how the liquidity works. I mean, Great example would be LinkedIn, which most people don't think of as a marketplace, but it is a marketplace because ultimately what it is a marketplace for buyers and sellers of talent. And almost all the money from LinkedIn comes in from the buyers of talent through recruiters and corporations that are paying for LinkedIn subscriptions. And the key is at the beginning stages of LinkedIn, Reed understood that the most important thing was to get to critical scale, and that a LinkedIn with 100 profiles is useless. A LinkedIn with 1,000 profiles is useless. You need to get to LinkedIn with 1,000,000 profiles. And so his focus initially was on attracting in the users by any means necessary, using viral marketing and things like that to get to scale quickly. And then ultimately, with that asset, then beginning to attract in the buyers of talent. And so, again, you look at this scenario and what you need to focus on changes. The initial focus of LinkedIn has to be, how do we get as many profiles as going as possible? But then once you get to a certain level, then you have to say, okay, well, how do I make this as effective for buyers of talent as possible? And that then sometimes leads you back on the other side to the sellers, right? So the idea being, well, if we can get them to engage with LinkedIn more often, their information will be fresher and it'll be more appealing to the buyers of talent, especially if the buyers of talent can see what's going on with the talent. And if you think about it, that's why LinkedIn's content strategy has been effective. Like, LinkedIn has become a major content channel for people like you and I. I believe we're streaming live to LinkedIn right now. And that in turn has made it more appealing to the buyers of talent, because they can say, oh, I can get a much better sense of who this person is already. I don't even need to talk to them. I can see all the stuff they put out there.
Yeah, I'm trying to, like, obviously, like, Ting is a super mature business that's part of Microsoft at this point. So there's a lot of complication. But uh, let's say pre-Microsoft acquisition, right? Essentially, what they did is, in the first years, they did everything they could to get, people, just regular professionals, on the platform and create value for them. And they ignored the recruiters. And they're just
Right.
like, let's get professionals on here and do everything we can to get professionals on here. And then eventually they said, okay, well, we have the professionals. That's good. We've cracked that nut. And you have these network effects that everyone just creates a LinkedIn account. We don't need to focus on them as much. What we need to be focused on is getting recruiters to use this. And, as a person who uses paid LinkedIn, you see they actually build a lot of new things, and they're always
Yeah.
improving it a lot more than on, the free kind of professional side. And so that changed as the business got more mature.
That's right. And again, this could always change. It can continually change. And instead of relying on feeling like, oh, we've solved it, the problem's solved forever, you always have to look at the core issue of, how are we providing liquidity? How can we provide better liquidity? How are we doing relative to the competition? Now, the beauty of a two-sided marketplace is, if you do become the dominant market leader, it becomes almost impossible for anyone to displace you. I always use the example of Craigslist and eBay. Right? These are things that have still not been displaced many decades after their founding, many decades after their last innovation, and yet they're still very powerful. Craigslist, of course, has slowly been losing business over time, compensated by the overall rise in e-commerce, because people come in and specialize in one specific transaction. So Airbnb comes in and picks off the rentals market. LinkedIn comes in and picks off the jobs market, and so on and so forth. And there is that tension with Craigslist, of Craigslist being an everything place for transactions. And the same holds true, by the way, for Amazon, right? Amazon has to balance two interesting tensions. One is for their interface to be consistent across everything that they sell. And the other is the fact that Amazon is not set up to optimize for selling a particular type of product. So if you're just selling clothes, you can do a better job of just selling clothes than Amazon does. Or if you are just selling, what have you. Like, Amazon, to some extent, is still reflects a design that was originally designed to sell books. And obviously they've made it work for a lot of other things. But the fact is that this balance between focus in order to deliver a better product and breadth in order to have the largest possible market is a tension that all marketplaces have to navigate.
So, okay, I have two last questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, what is the one thing that you believe startup founders who are building a clearly, obviously a marketplace business, what is a one thing that you think they should take away from our conversation? And I want to ask you about people who are not obvious like marketplaces after is my second question. But
Yep.
what's like if you're building something that's just obviously a marketplace, what is the one thing that they should take away from our conversation?
Your core product is not your product. Your core product is liquidity.
And then for people, let's say, who are building LinkedIn,
Mhm.
right, where it's like, well, LinkedIn is more of a social network than a marketplace. You could like you can apply the marketplace. Like you can say Instagram is a marketplace between or Google is a marketplace, of advertisers and viewers of ads. Right, so everything can. A lot of businesses can be analyzed as a marketplace.
That's right.
So I guess my question is, if you're building something, let's say at Google, that could be analyzed as a marketplace, to what extent is it useful to use this marketplace analogy as a framework? And like, can that be overdone? And is it underdone? Like, what's the kind of like role of that everything is a marketplace framework in how folks should be thinking of their businesses?
Yeah, I think that the key thing to remember is the first principle, which is that the core product is liquidity. So if we think about something like Instagram, what does liquidity mean? Liquidity means in the form of the content creator that when I put content out there, I will have an audience and that audience will interact with what I'm doing. I will get positive feedback. Right? The 13-year-old who's posting on Instagram isn't thinking about, hey, I'm a participant in a global marketplace for attention. They're thinking, I want more likes. I want people to think I'm cool. And so that is where the liquidity comes in. And then the other side of it is, let's imagine the person who is an Instagram user or a TikTok consumer. It's like, well, give me liquidity. Give me stuff that will distract me, entertain me, make me laugh, make me cry in very short segments as efficiently as possible. And so even though they're not traditional marketplaces in the sense that money is changing hands, they are marketplaces for something else, which in this case is attention. And you can still use the marketplace mental model or analogy to think very effectively about how do I improve the liquidity of attention in this case. So I think that it's very powerful to use the liquidity model, even in things that are not traditionally considered a liquidity-based marketplace, because again, we think of it as money changing hands, but sometimes it's attention, sometimes it's some other form of currency.
Yeah, and I'm thinking right now about YouTube, and YouTube, in a way, is two marketplaces in one. So there's the kind of like viewers of YouTube, and then the producers of content on YouTube. Let's say us, we're broadcasting on YouTube right now, and then there's another marketplace, which is the viewers of YouTube, and then the advertisers on YouTube, which is whoever it is that's paying to advertise on this live stream. So, like, is it useful to think about things at that level of complexity? Like, is it just adding complexity to the understanding your business, or does it provide clarity?
It provides clarity. So, what people have when they don't do the deeper analysis is the illusion of understanding and the illusion of clarity. And many people love the illusion of clarity. It makes them feel good, even though it doesn't serve them. So, what I often tell people is when you're analyzing a situation, you're going to try to get your analysis to be as accurate in terms of making predictions about what will happen as possible. Right? That's the purpose of understanding. The purpose of understanding is be able to make accurate predictions about the future. And so that's how you measure whether or not your understanding is correct, not by how it makes you feel, not by the fact that it seems elegant. And so many times you will have to be more complicated than would feel comfortable. But then the way to deal with that complexity is, I like to say, just unbundle everything, break it down, get down to individual components which you can understand. And you may not be able to understand all of the individual components at the same time because your brain can't hold that much, but you can focus on one piece at a time to figure out how to make it work. And so if we think about the double marketplace of YouTube, we say, well, there's the audience and creator marketplace, and then there's also the advertising marketplace. And by the way, there's multiple advertising marketplaces. There's the advertising marketplace of programmatic advertising that YouTube is placing itself. And then there's a hidden informal marketplace, as you see on all these YouTube videos where they talk about a sponsor, and they have a sponsor that comes, and that sponsor is not a part of the YouTube advertising system. It's a separate system. And so it becomes very complicated to think about all these things. But if you're a YouTuber, you got to think about it in all those different ways, because a simpler, easier to retain in the mind understanding doesn't allow you to most effectively make predictions about the future and make the best decisions for your business.
So maybe the kind of like one takeaway for, by the way, I'm stealing this idea. I'm trying to always ask for like one takeaway.
Yes.
Now in all the interviews I do, which was like I'm stealing this idea from Masters of Scale, who have these like fire rounds. I don't know what lightning rounds.
Lightning round, yes.
So this is my like mini lightning round. But maybe the one takeaway for people who are not building a marketplace, or who believe they're not building a marketplace, is ask yourself how you might be building a marketplace, and right, like that might be the one takeaway.
That's right. There is likely a marketplace element to your business, and that element is not considered a marketplace because no money is changing hands, but some other thing of value is. And if that is true, then a marketplace analysis may help you reach decisions you wouldn't otherwise come to.
And that's not how you talk about your business. So let's say if you talk to investors, you want to say like, I'm building YouTube, and this is actually 3 marketplaces in one. It's like, what are you talking about?
Right, it'll scare them.
But you want to think it through for yourself so you can get the deep understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because again, the key is not how do you feel about your understanding, it's how effective is that understanding at allowing you to make accurate predictions about the future, which allows you to make better decisions. So, Chris, this has been super helpful. So thank you for your time. Everyone who's watching, thank you for spending the last 45 minutes with us. Please, if you want to get more insight from Chris, I know I learned so much from talking to him. Just like this video or subscribe if you're on YouTube, and if you're on podcasts, I think it's follow or whatever it is. We broadcast live a bunch of interviews with guests. So I did one actually right before this, Chris. And on Monday or Tuesday next week, we're doing one, which I think either I'll do or you'll do, with a really famous person. And called Reddy, who's the top kind of streetwear person in Africa. So I'm really excited for that one. So if people subscribe either to Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, any of those, they'll see all those interviews because they're not on our Apple Podcast feed. So if you're listening to this on podcasts, which I know most people do, it's worth subscribing other places. So that was my spiel there. And Chris, great talking to you as ever. Likewise, Julian, and everyone, looking forward to the next conversation.